The subliminal self in some way, shape or form is constantly monitoring the external environment. And so we're picking up adverts and marketing communications and other people telling us about products, even though we're not registering it necessarily consciously. It just informs what we do and informs our behavior.
Keep watching to learn more.
Book 4 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the application of parapsychology in the field of marketing, and I'm honored to have with me Mark Tadajewski, who is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Marketing Management and is a professor of marketing associated with several universities in the United Kingdom, including Royal Holloway, University of London, the University of York, Durham University, and the Open University. Mark, of course, is based in the United Kingdom. And now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Mark. It is a real pleasure to be with you today. I'm very excited to introduce a new topic to New Thinking Aloud, the application of parapsychology in your discipline of marketing.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's really great to be here.
Many people will say, what? What do these two fields have to do with each other? And I'm under the impression that probably many people in your own discipline would be very surprised to know that there's actually a long history associating the paranormal with the fields of marketing and advertising.
Yeah, a much longer history than to be honest, I appreciated, because marketing, when it's kind of presented to students or scholars generally, is framed as applied economics. And associated with the label of economics is a very particular description of the consumer, i.e. as somebody that's economically minded, quite rational, and thinks about the marketplace in very conscious, deliberative terms. Now, that always struck me as kind of interesting, because most people don't act like that generally in everyday life. And I always find it difficult to believe that business people, many years ago didn't realize that people can be quite idiosyncratic. They can be quite stuck in their habits and their routines, and that they don't necessarily weigh up every consumption decision, every time they make it. Because, who would live like that? It would drive anybody kind of crazy, even 150 years ago. So when I started to kind of think, well, okay, I'll look at how marketing is described as applied economics and who actually makes the case and how they make that case. And when I started to do a little bit of digging, it just seemed to be that there were lots of very prominent names saying that, but they're not really substantiating it or fleshing it out in any meaningful form. So I thought, okay, this is really intriguing. And I was already aware that psychology had a kind of checkered history in marketing generally. And the more I started to dig, I started to find kind of themes of particular figures that basically have been kind of written out the discipline or forgotten for various reasons. Maybe their ideas weren't picked up generally in textbooks or by people that became very, very popular. And then when you start to read their work, and read the original sources rather than what other people have said, because it's never a great idea to necessarily trust people's kind of readings of early scholars, you find much, much more complicated and complex kind of engagements with human psychology, human consciousness. And again, one of the earliest sources of insight in terms of the complexity of psychological functioning was not psychology as a discipline per se, but it was psychical research, associated with the Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882, as you've discussed many times on this channel. And what I was finding, the more I looked into it, the Society for Psychical Research seemed to be a real foundation for thinkers that were either ended up working and writing about advertising, like Harlow Gale, who had actually been a member of the Society for Psychical Research, engaged in empirical research projects with them, studied clairvoyance, had attended seances, all of these different things. And Gale's perspective basically mobilized his earlier engagement with psychical research and used that as a prism to make sense of advertising. And Gale was just one of many figures that I started to find that were touching upon this literature and engaging it with it in really interesting ways, and in ways that never really disappear from the discipline either.
Your research goes as far back as the 18th century, and the findings of Franz Anton Mesmer, who's considered today sort of the founder of what we now call hypnosis.
The really fascinating thing, well, obviously, Adam Crabtree's work in particular, he's been on the channel, I think, a few times, has written some amazing stuff about Mesmer and his influence on subsequent thinking about consciousness. So from Mesmer to the Marquis de Puysegur, through to Frederick Myers, they're all exploring, well, Mesmer was much more physiologically oriented and didn't really pay too much attention to the psychology of the people that he was actually treating, whereas de Puysegur did, and obviously Myers took that in really interesting directions by explicating in much more detail the kind of strata that de Puysegur was talking about. So de Puysegur talked about consciousness and unconscious behavior he was writing like 1770, and again, so if you go back to the original sources, and Adam, I think, has just published the original version of de Puységur's manuscript that's only literally just appeared, and you read that and there's references to clairvoyance, very, very deep trances, various forms of telepathy, broadly speaking, and again, just indicating a much richer understanding of human beings, the complex nature of their interaction dynamics, and how they seem to make sense of conditions and environments that exceed normal sensory kind of boundaries. And again, it's really accessible research. It's now available for everybody that doesn't read French, and I don't read French, which is terrible, or German, or any of the cool languages I really should know. So I was looking at a lot of this stuff, and what intrigued me was the idea that, okay, these are foundational figures for psychology generally. And the more I read their original work and then started to look at the development of marketing thought, even up to the present day, you still see similar themes to, mesmeric kind of themes appearing in contemporary marketing thought. They're talking about people and their personal magnetism and how they can control an audience in a room, for example, and the flows of energy that pass between people. And for the life of me, a lot of the earlier material seems to be much more theoretically kind of unpicked and unpacked than a lot of the contemporary research that just says things like, oh, there are vibes that people are picking up. So I found it fascinating. So Crabtree's work was really important for me. And so from Crabtree, I was bouncing from Mesmer to Puységur and then to Frederick Myers' work, which if people in the audience haven't read it, I mean, it's stunning work, particularly his writings on the subliminal consciousness that are just so sophisticated. It's fascinating, but also it makes you feel quite bad as a contemporary scholar, because here you've got people that were doing this basically part-time when they've got full-time jobs, some of them. And Myers' work is just, it's rich in its intellectual substance, it's empirically based, and it's conceptually just fascinating. So in terms of talking about, the fact that we're basically human strata. So our minds are made up of the superliminal mind and the subliminal consciousness. Now, what I found really fascinating about Myers was, one, his ideas were way more developed than Freud's. Obviously, Freud appears a little bit later, but they debated in the SBR proceedings, or Freud did on his own because Myers was dead. And Freud's work was a lot weaker than Myers when I read it. But Myers' account of subliminal processes that still exhibit their own consciousness, I thought was absolutely intriguing. And then when you read all of the SBR studies and they're talking about how people engage in problem solving while they're asleep, or Myers' work when he's referencing Robert Louis Stevenson and how Stevenson used to basically prime his own subconscious, basically. So whenever he was running out of money, he would go, right, I need to write a story. I need to come up with something. And he would, worry about it, go to sleep, And he used to have he would fall asleep and dream, and he said he had an internal theatre, and he would see his stories played out in the theatre by little participants who arguably, he said, produced much more interesting stories than he ever could. All he ever did was polish and publish them. So I was fascinated by all this mental complexity, and so when I was reading the marketing literature, and they were saying, oh, until 1950, we viewed the consumer or people generally as quite rational, quite reasonable, and they're focusing only on consciousness rather than all the levels beneath. I thought, well, this cannot be right, and so I started to explore some of those issues in more detail.
From my limited knowledge of your discipline, the name J.B. Watson comes to mind. In the 1920s, I understand he was a marketing and advertising specialist, but in the field of psychology, he's known as the father of behaviorism, and it was his work that sort of turned the whole field of psychology away from the study of consciousness and all of the nuances and subtleties of psychical research and strictly focused on human behavior.
Yeah, he's an interesting one in the sense that he's often highlighted as, oh, here's this big psychologist coming into industry and teaching industry players, advertising agencies about the nuances of human behavior. But he apparently didn't have a great deal of influence, in the sense he was more a symbolic hiring, because when you actually read some of the literature, so there's a very famous study published, I think it was 1926-ish, called Theories of Selling by E.K. Strong. Now, Strong makes the case that there are three main perspectives in advertising, or the way advertising thinks about the consumer. And only one of those is behaviorism, and it's not really picked up in any meaningful way. The other perspective that Strong articulates is much more complex and much more dynamic. In other words, you can't just see the consumer as somebody to whom something is done. The consumer also reacts to how you're promoting to them, what you're saying, and whether it fits with their lifestyle, their views, their values, etc. Now, what E.K. Strong absolutely avoids is the idea that he basically doesn't talk about the unconscious or subconscious in any way, shape, or form. Now, the reason why he does that, I think, is because he's focusing a lot on the arguments that have been put forward by a guy called Walter Dill Scott, who was probably the most influential advertising pioneer in the early 20th century. He used to write a lot for he was very, very, very influential. He ended up as the president of Northwestern, actually. But he used to write about advertising, and he had quite a simplistic model of the consumer. And they were basically rational and also emotional. And he defined the human being as basically a creature of suggestion. Now, he didn't really engage with the unconscious in any way, shape, or form either. But he was a hugely important person who influenced all the people that followed him. So after 1912, roughly. Now, what you read when you start to look at Walter Dill Scott's work is that he has an absolute abhorrence for psychical research. And he makes it very, very clear. He calls it like medieval superstition. And it seems to stem, one, from the fact that he's trying to make his interpretation of psychology appealing to business people. And business people apparently weren't too hot on anything that smacked of supernaturalism at that point. Whether or not that's an accurate representation of psychical research, which it's not, but we'll leave that to one side. But so Walter Dill Scott's making all these assertions about psychical research. He says, nobody of any repute studies it. There's very little actual empirical experimentation undertaken. And it's just laughable. Again, when you know about the names who were doing the research, so you've got Camille Flammarion, who Carlos
Alvarado.
Yeah, reviewed really recently on the channel again. So you've got William James, obviously the father of psychology, and probably one of the most sophisticated psychological thinkers, not only at that point, but probably still in the present day, to be honest, in terms of his receptiveness to many alternative ways of thinking. And again, another figure that's been massively misrepresented. James's writing on psychical kind of research was extensive and really kind of careful, but that's written out of a lot of the representations of him, which is frankly bizarre, and can only be either incompetence or politics. But I'll leave that to one side. But So you've got Walter Dill Scott basically making these arguments that psychical research is basically untrustworthy. The only people that engage in it are charlatans, and we're not charlatans, we're scientists. And basically, his interpretation of the scientific method seems to be, I'm not interested in engaging with this body of literature, so I'm just not going to bother reading it. And if I am going to read it, I'm going to misrepresent it in fairly substantial ways. And his work, those kind of arguments were picked up by lots of people and responded to by people like Henry Sidgwick, who's the president of the SBR from 1882, periodically for quite a while. But he would go back and he would read their arguments and then read the literature they claim to be interpreting and say, well, wait a minute, none of this is an accurate representation of what they said. So there are lots of these highly partial and partisan representations of psychical research. But I started to explore this, and I noted that one of I think it was Andreas Sommer, who writes a really interesting work on psychical research. He wrote in a footnote that Harlow Gale was a really important figure. And I knew obviously the name. I was like, okay, he's one of the earliest experimentalists in advertising, really notable academic who had a very short career, because Gale was somewhat rebellious and not easily controlled, and it caused him to lose his job eventually. But so I started looking at Harlow Gale's work, and so you look at his background, and he was going to train to be a minister, but he couldn't keep the faith. He didn't believe in spiritualism, he didn't believe in God, he didn't believe in the soul, all of these factors, but he was fascinated by psychical research and the complexity it seemed to indicate about psychological functioning. So he started participating, joining, reading all the material, just diving into it head first and teaching it. He was teaching like 40 hours of it when he was working at Minnesota. And so Gale's like one of the key pioneers in early advertising thought, probably one of the most not misrepresented figures, but most underrated figures ever, I think. And what Gale was doing, just to give you some more context, so as what we would call an early career researcher now, so not a PhD student, around that kind of level, he was going to seances. And he said that he was basically tasked with, go along, see this guy. He seems to be heavily spiritualist in orientation, seems to have visions, and he's got a cadre of people kind of surrounding him, lots of acolytes. See what you think. And so Gale would go along, and he describes, his trips to seances with Mrs. Gale. They were clearly having a great time. And he would sit there and he would watch the dynamics in the seance room. So again, he's not closing down the option of it being a legitimate phenomenon, this guy having, like Mrs. Piper, connections that people can't really understand, or tapping into information that nobody else can identify. But he's there watching this guy who seems to be feeding suggestions to different audience members or different seance participants, particularly the neophytes, all the new people arriving. He's going, can you see this? Can you see that? Can you see this? And other people encouraging them all to see the visions. And Gale basically goes, what we've got here, I think, it's a suggestion dynamic. That's the operation here. And he goes, it's really fascinating in the sense that it contests the way that lots of people view human psychology. And at that point, it was a kind of idiomatter articulation of psychological functioning. In other words, if I make a suggestion to you, for example, about doing X, Y, or Z, you go and do X, Y, and Z without much thinking about it. Gale goes, this isn't the dynamic in play here. There were people contesting this person's view. And he said, what we're seeing, I think, is something called idea. In other words, one person puts an idea forward, but the other person with their own viewpoint and value system articulates a countervailing argument, basically, in their head or face-to-face, and so diffuses the original suggestion. So he was saying the dynamics are much more complicated. And so he used that as a prism to make sense of his early studies in advertising. So he's there, he knows Meyer's work profoundly. He talks about the multiplex nature of human personality and functioning. In other words, we're made up of a superliminal and a subliminal self, at least one, perhaps more subliminal selves, and both have consciousness. And so Gale's there going, okay, this is really interesting. Advertising seems to be an interesting context for study, because he's basically read a book, I think, it's never cited anywhere, but there's a book that appears a few years before Gale's empirical research that he's conducting between 1896, I think, and 1900. But a guy called Fowler was writing a book published a book in 1880. roughly 1888, I think. And it's a reflection on advertising, but it's anecdotal. And Fowler's making all these interpretations of advertising going, I think it influences us in the farthest reaches of our brain. And I think advertising affects us unconsciously. And it's like, this is 1888. So the argument that marketing's viewing the consumer as rational in 1950 seems even more implausible when you've got a guy who's a business practitioner in the late kind of 19th century going, no, human beings are much more complicated. So Gale explores that empirically and basically goes, yeah, there does seem to be this point where some people do make quite rational and reasonable decisions, but there are lots of people who are engaged in buying this brand, that brand, this product, but they can't really explain why. And Gale thinks that it's basically the argument is that the subliminal self in some way, shape or form is constantly monitoring the external environment. And so we're picking up adverts and marketing communications and other people telling us about products, even though we're not registering it necessarily consciously. It just informs what we do and informs our behavior. And so Gale goes, yeah, there definitely seems to be some kind of influence point here. So we've got conscious decision making and we've got unconscious decision making. Unconscious decision making being basically whenever anybody couldn't explain why they bought something, that became the domain of the unconscious, which, you've got to bear in mind the time. It seems legitimate, to say that.
There's a concept that you write about that I gather has become rather dominant in the field of marketing called atmospherics. I believe developed by Kotler, the idea that marketers can't consider merely the product itself. They have to look at the whole atmosphere in which the product is sold. And of course, even the word atmosphere suggests something like the human aura.
Oh, yeah. Or again, it takes us straight back to Mesmer. Mesmer talking about the celestial environment shaping everything on the planet, basically, and animal magnetism and so on. And again, when you think about Mesmer, you've got to think about the therapeutic context. Mesmer was a very colourful character who had a amazing salon in Paris. Great windows which he would close, and he would limit air circulation so people would kind of find it difficult to breathe. And he would walk in his lavender robes with his big wand, and people would they would again, like the Gale seance, they would see other people undergoing these therapeutic kind of convulsions, basically, and seemingly going through some degree of kind of stress and then suddenly being better. And so what you've got there, again, you've got people anticipating, oh gosh, I'm going to see Mesmer in this environment that seems to fit. There are people playing gentle music, there's nice smells. In other words, he's patterning the context, the curative context around them. And then he's dressed in a way that's likely to make them kind of react to him in ways that are exactly what he would like therapeutically. So my argument was, okay, not only does Mesmer seem to be an important kind of a jumping off point for much thinking about human consciousness later on, taking Crabtree's work as the kind of argument there, but also he's molding the context around people in ways that make them act in ways that will ultimately benefit him as well as them. Obviously cured, and they pay him, and he gets good word of mouth, and hopefully the big pension that he desperately wanted from the French government. Now, what you see pretty soon after that are very famous retailers, so working in the kind of late 19th century. So John Wanamaker in Philadelphia, if you've ever seen the pictures of his retail stores, I mean, he had two of them, more than two at one point, but two major ones. They were stunning. I mean, the most awe-inspiring kind of locations you could imagine. And he would, again, Wanamaker eventually became astoundingly wealthy, and he was very attuned to the fact that he wanted to kind of enhance the transportation dynamics in the environment. In other words, you walk into the Wanamaker kind of store, and he said people need new experiences. They want it to be the latest fashions, the latest. He said that we can't stay the same. We have to be doing new things all the time. We think consumption now is crazy. Even then, they're aware that you couldn't remain, in stasis, basically. So he used to create proper, French salons and miniature versions of French streets in his store that were apparently so impressive that people did feel like they were literally on French territory. And he was bringing in all the latest fashions and so on. So again, recreating the environment around people. But what you start to see in a lot of that literature, it's very it's sometimes subtle in terms of its psychical influences, but sometimes not. So you hear of people talking about salespeople needing to generate personal magnetism. Now that might be enhance your confidence, your presentation of self. Do you look right? For the role that you're taking. Are you likely to appeal to the customer? Can you talk to somebody that might be of a higher station than you in a way that won't put them off? And some of the people making this advice often went a lot further, and it was, you can use combinations of normal psychological influence mechanisms, or you can engage in forms of telepathy. So in other words, you can prime customers mentally by thinking almost very positive thoughts about what they're going to do and how they're going to act and how they're going to perceive you, and that would somehow transfer to the consumer or your target. And so again, very complex kind of literature. But when you read a lot of this material, you get the same citations appearing. So the name that people should be looking for in the early literature, in particular, at this point, is a guy called Thompson J. Hudson, who wrote a book called the Law of Psychic Phenomena. Now, that's heavily based on SPR-related publications and also his own experiments. Not too many. Now, he makes the case that all the people that you're going to be engaging with in a retail store, in this case, they're going to have an objective mind and a subjective mind. You basically want to try and avoid engaging somebody's objective mind, because the subjective mind is the suggestible part of somebody's thinking. That's the element you need to be kind of approaching. So there's a whole stream of material on that. But a lot of the literature, it's very mesmerically related. So it's a lot about, again, crafting a selling personality. But in some cases, it is, as you mentioned, it does shade heavily into aura-related discourses. And like, again, the key example, not necessarily in that time period, or no, roughly that time period, but it would be William Walker Atkinson. Now he's super famous in New Thought circles. New Thought circles, writes about Theosophy as well, basically turned his hand to yoga, very, very, very adept writer and very knowledgeable. And he writes a lot about the using psychical powers basically in retailing, sales and marketing related practices. And he lists all the different colors of auras that you're likely to confront. He seems to assume that most people are either clairvoyant or trainee clairvoyance or trainee kind of psychically related in some way, or he often describes them as you want to become a sensitive. A lot that appears quite a lot in the literature. Now, so he's there going, green signet, if you see somebody with a green aura, that suggests that they're highly jealous. Yellow, high level of intellectuality, all of these different ways of basically getting past people's rationalization. So if I ask you, tell me what goods you want to buy, what you're interested in, you might give me an extreme rationalization because you want me to look at you in a positive light. However, if I can see your aura and your energy signal, you can't hide that from me. So therefore, I can get past all your barriers and your borders. And he often went to kind of extreme lengths. So there's an example in a sales meeting. So it sounds like somebody's gone to another person's office trying to sell them a good. And he describes one person having a much stronger aura than the other person. And so it almost changes into like a lightning storm around the stronger aura character. So he's describing lightning bolts hitting the other person, eventually beating them into submission, which is kind of a violent interpretation and operationalization of a lot of the psychical literature. But what fascinated me was that this was appearing regularly, particularly in the period between roughly 1900 to about 1911. And it was appearing in books that were, they were reaching huge audiences. They were either been giving to correspondence school students. Think of that as distance learning for basically people that couldn't afford to go to university but wanted to enhance their educational profile and keep improving their career. They would subscribe to a correspondence school, get small booklets that would describe current practice in sales education, and they'd read that at night. But what William Walker Atkinson's books were being reprinted, like super regularly. Authors now would kill for the level of distribution that he received. And so it was extremely widespread. And when you read his books, there's a very clear get out of jail free card. So he describes all of these psychical practices. So here are auras, here are thought forms, again, speaking to Theosophy, which often highlight the fact people won't tell you the truth. So, you could look above somebody's. There's an example in a church, as a case in point, and he's talking about looking at the congregation. And so they're meant to be listening to the priest or the vicar and taking in the edifying sermon that's being provided. And he says, when you look out on the audience, what you don't see people thinking about, God and how grateful they are. You see whiskey bottles floating above their heads and all of these other things that they're thinking about at that point. Which, again, it's a smart interpretation of human thinking, really. But what I really liked was, so you read all of his books and he gives you exercises. And it's stuff like, so you want to enhance your telepathic abilities. It's almost like he's almost like a historical interpretation of Rupert Sheldrake. So it's like, okay, I want you to go into a building or a church or wherever and stare at the back of somebody's head. You need to concentrate so hard that they turn around. And so he's there going, if you can do that, then you're exerting some kind of mental force on them, and that you have to keep improving and improving that. And it's always, if you can't do it, please just read the book again and practice and practice and practice and practice. It's never due to the book. It's never due to the arguments or the fact that there might be limited validity. It's always on the student who's not reading carefully or practicing enough.
The New Thought movement and Theosophy and other similar movements seem to be, from my point of view, involved in uplifting people, enhancing their spiritual and psychic capacities, whereas you describe in your writing a kind of toxic direction that marketing and advertising took, where the ideal was to get people to feel bad about themselves so that they would buy particular products like I need deodorant. I need certain fashions in order to feel good. Otherwise, I don't feel like I'm good enough.
This is one of the big benefits of reading New Thought or Theosophy in the present, is that I do like the optimism. I do like the way it encourages people to have a sense of confidence in themselves that they may not, if they don't possess the educational background, the social cachet or capital that other people have. It was a very positive, very energizing set of literatures. And I think even now you can still benefit from reading a lot of that material. I think it's really helpful. But what you start to see in certain, again, as consumerism is ramping up in the early 20th century, there's the emergence of a much more critical literature, and they start to talk about the way psychic atmospheres are being mobilized, and it's a guy called Vaughan in particular, and it's not a positive interpretation. Basically, he argues, right, people are being encouraged to not look at the price of goods, but rather to focus on the brand and the way this product might enhance their lives at that moment. But it's always done in a way that, in other words, you need this product to complete yourself or to make yourself feel better or to stop yourself being socially dysfunctional in some way. And again, because again, the whole impetus of capitalism generally is that it needs you to keep going into the marketplace. And so marketeers at this point were starting to talk about, well, you bought that product last year, that's out of date now, it might be perfectly functional, it might still be efficient, it might still be exactly what you need, but you know what, here's the new version that everyone else values much more importantly than the version you've got. Think about the new phones that people buy. My old phone works fine, but the new one is the one I need to have, to stand out and fit in with people or whatever. And he starts to point out that this is a really toxic way of looking at the world. It encourages people, again, to just keep going into the marketplace and buying, thinking that it's going to make them happy. And it never will, because what marketeers are selling, he kind of implies, and this is a theme that appears regularly in the critical literature on marketing generally, is that marketing is not selling satisfaction. It's not about looking at you and going, okay, here's what you really need, and we're going to provide this to you as a way of improving yourself or whatever. He argues, and later thinkers, including Gordon Blaine Hancock in the 1920s and Gene Kilbourne in the 1980s, and Rick Pollard at the same time, he argues that marketers are really trying to create dissatisfaction. They want to make you unhappy with yourself so that they can sell you the product that will then make you whole, make you feel better, the clothes that will hide the bulges that they've told you you've got. And the most recent exemplar, or not the most recent, but one of the obvious exemplars is cellulite. Was promoted by Vogue magazine in the late 1960s. Previously, before that, it wasn't viewed as a problem. It was just a factory deposit nobody really cared about. But when it became a thing to be looked at in a fashion magazine and it was given a label, it then became something that you could treat. You know, it's the antidote product to the problem that it's created. You know, that's being created by the marketeer effectively.
It's as if they've learned that they can use subconscious motivation in a negative way to mobilize people. And you see the same thing in politics, actually.
Yeah, well, again, it's an interesting literature in the sense that when you read Gale's work in particular, so he's talking a lot about, you know, the subconscious and the way people engage with advertising. And again, until relatively recently, until kind of the 1980s roughly, there were lots of views of advertising that presented it as quite a powerful force. In other words, I can move you from complete disinterest in this product, you know, through interest, and then I can get you to desire it, and then I can get you to go out and buy it. Now that's a really, really strong. That assumes the marketeers are, you know, omnipotent. You know, they control you and you're a plaything for them. It's a puppet master kind of model. Now, Harlow Gale was noting that even in the early 20th century, people, might be stratified in terms of subliminal and subconscious. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're uncritical at any point. He was finding that when people were asked to look at advertisements, they would just basically critique them and deconstruct them. Well, I don't believe that claim. I think that's a joke. I don't believe that's going to do that for me, or that piano is going to enhance my social circle or whatever. And the marketing literature is very, you know, throughout its history and now with AI and whatever, it's very good at saying, hey, we've got something that's great and it's going to, you know, we can sell it to the consumer and we can make a lot of money. But the consumer equally can be quite critical and respond backwards. Well, I'm not really interested in that. And I can't afford it. I'm not going to participate. So you do see, particularly in from the 80s onwards, a very specific kind of group of theorists associated with social cognitive theory. Now, at one point, they were making an argument a little bit like the one you kind of gestured towards, and it's like marketeers can influence us at basically the subliminal level. It's not quite the Vance Packard argument that we saw in the 60s and 70s, but it's like they can shape our behavior in ways that we do not necessarily appreciate or we don't necessarily register. They've since rode back on that quite a lot because, again, it was kind of difficult to replicate a lot of the arguments that they were making or substantiate them. And some of the thinkers associated with that group of that particular perspective, it's called priming, basically. Your behavior can be primed in ways you don't appreciate, and yet you act in the way that the marketeer wants. They found that people generally don't necessarily do that. And so it's tied up with the replication crisis in psychology. A lot of the figures overlap. So again, people may say marketing is powerful, and marketeers do that, unless, of course, the government is looking at them and saying, well, wait a minute, maybe we need to legislate and control you. Then suddenly, no, we're all about consumer sovereignty and the consumer's reflective, and we just give them what they want, and we can only help inform them. We can't control them. The messages change depending on the stakeholder.
I think it's fascinating that in your writing, you have picked up on some of the latest developments in the field of consciousness research, the idea of a post-materialistic world, the idea that, according to the great physicist Max Planck, consciousness itself is fundamental. And I think you're saying that people in the field of marketing have to take that idea seriously. What do you think the implications are for marketers today?
Aren't quite post-materialist, but you know, you can see how they're kind of roughly heading there. So at the moment, you've of course got people operationalizing telepathy in fairly standard ways. So you've got materialist and synthetic forms of telepathy. The obvious examples there are, think Neuralink. the idea that you can plant a chip in someone's brain, and you can use the chip to engage with your computer, move a cursor, a game, or what have you. I'm guessing that's not going to fly too well after the political situation in the States, and the idea of letting a billionaire plant chips in your brain is probably not something most people will be subscribing to, unless, of course, they need it for really important medical reasons, which is the way they're going to sell that and the wedge they're using to introduce it. But I think in terms of what I found with when you look at the material from, I mean, really from De Puziger through the SBR, through Elmer Wheeler in the 1960s as a salesman in working in America, talking about subconsciouses kind of tapping into each other when people are walking past bookshops, and then arranging for the actual people to meet, and it being really important in terms of business practice and opportunities. You've seen these references keep coming up. And it's the same thing. There's, the idea that we're biological machines or man as a machine or whatever. I mean, that was simplistic 150 years ago. Now even Myers was thinking in ways far more complicated. And yet you still see in the top ranked journals in marketing that they talk about biological machines. But again, when you look at those cases of people talking about mind-to-mind influence, or the fact that there are effective interactions between people. So a lot of the recent consumer research is moving in lines very much like the Global Consciousness Project, in the sense that you see people going to rock events, football stadiums, and so on, and they're all somehow knowing what, everybody's working in unison. They're all affecting each other. They seem, people are describing the fact that they seem to know what everyone else is thinking and the way that they're going to act. Now, look, nobody's saying this is telepathic, but it certainly sounds like something very similar, but people clearly don't want to use the terminology. So they talk about, effect. An effect as a concept is very, very vague generally. It's this idea that we all have the capacity to affect and be affected. Well, you see that stuff in Theosophy in the 1930s, and they make very similar arguments, and yet people are doing that now. And what I think that we need to take really seriously is the fact that I think marketing, consumer research, and a lot of the management disciplines generally are happy to use these very vague kind of conceptual approaches. And I think there's a lot to be learned from projects like the Global Consciousness Project, and people working in, Roger Nelson, working in those kind of rough areas where they're saying, look, we're seeing the fact that there can be psychological material kind of effects on the environment, that people seemingly can interact in ways that we can't really understand at the moment. I think there's a great deal of cross-fertilization that needs to happen. I think the academic climate makes it very difficult, because a lot of these ideas are, again, they're unorthodox, but they're gathering a lot of pace. But I think publishing that kind of material would be tricky. But I think it's the direction, so not just synthetic or materialist telepathy. I think there seems to be, all of the evidence suggests that there's something else there. Yet the danger or the difficulty has been historically, whether it's in terms of marketing and consumer research from the early 20th century, is that it's very difficult to operationalize it as and when you need to use it. And that's the problem that people are kind of confronting. So when Mark Twain's going, I see telepathy replacing the telephone and telegraph, basically, because they're too cumbersome. Telepathy will enable us to talk really easily or communicate. Like René Walcolier's work, I can talk to people that don't speak my language, or there seems to be human-animal connections. All of these there are different areas of literature that all seem to be coming together around very specific themes, i.e. the sense of human interconnection. And I think this is pushing it to the nth level. But I think that's the direction we need to be looking at, rather than thinking AI or human technological affordances is the future. I think that's something being sold to us on a platter by billionaires that are going to make a lot of money from it, and also are going to consume vast amounts of energy, huge amounts of water, running huge data processing plants in ways that the planet probably can't sustain. I think looking towards the kind of work Roger was doing with the GCP, that we're seeing in related disciplines, that Dean Radin's doing in terms of genetic, the idea that you can genetically turn on some genes or whatever and potentially make people potentially psychic for a very short period of time. There's so much that could be really cool there and really interesting in a way that retains our humanism without going, I want to be a cyborg. I let everybody else go left. And I think the smart, whether it's business people or practitioners or whoever, should be going, yeah, okay, we'll invest in all of that stuff. But this is really interesting too. And this is where I say nobody, the idea that Stargate ended a long time ago and there's no ongoing kind of military research and so forth into a lot of the topics we've discussed is frankly not very plausible. I think that's a direction we need to take more seriously. And that's where marketing potentially could contribute, in the sense that there's a sub area of marketing called social marketing, and that's easily criticized as the antidote to commercial marketing, because social marketers basically try to encourage behavioral change. So in other words, don't consume all of that booze, don't smoke those cigarettes, exercise a bit more, be healthy, it'll be good for you, your family, and society generally. Now, they promote those kinds of ways of thinking and changing the way people engage with life generally. That seems to be an interesting potential connective with the idea that when human intentionality kind of combines, that it can have not only an important effect on the wider environment, but also that it might be a direction that we need to be taking much more seriously than we are. And so that probably seems quite utopian, but that seems to be the opportunity I think people need to be looking at a lot more.
How is your approach being received in your field of marketing and marketing management?
I was really wary when I started publishing the material in about 2022. I wasn't sure any of it would get through. I didn't think it would be convincing. I thought there might be some politics that would kind of prevent it being published. And fortunately, I found that it's actually been really well received. People obviously make you jump through a lot of hoops going, okay, so you're saying something fundamentally new about the development of the discipline, the fact it's deeply indebted to psychical research, that we're still seeing parapsychological material being explicitly cited through the 1960s and reappearing periodically later on, and that it seems to be a future direction, admittedly in a technological kind of sense, that practitioners could be taking. It ticks a lot of boxes. So you speak to people that want to look at the discipline differently. The people that are looking to make money out of it might look at what's being done in terms of brain interfaces. That seems to be the next kind of direction. But again, that's equally kind of scary in the sense that there are only a few people that can fund that kind of research in that direction. So at the moment, what I'm highlighting are places people could go and look. So it's only been published for a couple of years, or very recently in terms of the paper that you mentioned on atmospheres. So I'm not seeing how it's going to be used. If it's, at least it's been published, it's out there, people can engage with it in however they want. And it's given me interesting ideas for future directions as well. And also, when you point out that marketing has a deep debt to a lot of these different disciplines, and that they might be a way for us to think differently, whether it's about, again, from the atmosphere paper, I leap about a lot in the paper through, I look at the astral world, and then I talk about NDEs and out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences, and how this fundamentally often changes the way people look at the way they view their life, their consumption patterns, and the way they're going to live going forward, particularly if they've gone through kind of the life replay when they've seen all the really bad decisions they've made and how they've affected people really negatively. There's a lot of interesting kind of findings there, and I think again this echoes one of the I think the talk that you uploaded this morning that was on a post-material society. There are a lot of different ways of looking at the world that I think are really important, and it seems to dramatically impact the people that go through those experiences. I think marketing could probably learn a great deal by studying a lot of those kind of cases in more detail. So you've got Bruce Grayson's work, which is fantastic, and it's a really accessible book. But that's an area, marketers should go and study these people and talk to them about how this changes their orientation to life and see what we can learn and see if there's any, again, other messages we can take that will encourage people to perhaps live in ways that aren't not so necessarily materialistic in the sense of I must have the next item, but in ways that are rich in terms of the personal relationships and the ways they develop themselves. Because one of the cases in the book that I meant, or Grayson's work, is of a young woman who was she was 28 and had a near-death experience. And one of the things that she came away with was the idea that obviously material things weren't that important, but learning and education was something, for whatever reason, she believes she can take with her going forward. And so that's going to massively enhance her life, learning, reading, changing the way she perceives the world fundamentally. And it would be nice if people didn't need to nearly die, to get those kind of insights. But there's a lot there that I think is useful. And, if you want to be even more, if consumer researchers wanted to study something that I think is, it's fascinating, but it's about as provocative is not the right word, but studying basically the studies of reincarnation that were being kind of done at the University of Virginia and that are still ongoing. But looking at some of these people that seemingly have had a previous personality, and that when they track through the archives and they speak to people that knew them and they look at their physiology and they can see the scarring that may have been the result of a wound or whatever, or they notice very peculiar consumption habits, like very young children with a really kind of aggressive or kind of unhealthy interest in stimulants and intoxicants, and just trying to unravel, are these things that have, seem to be communicated through ways that we dimly understand. I think there are just so many, again, try not to be too excitable about it, but they're just cool, they're fascinating, and it's a bit more interesting than looking at whether I can flog somebody another box of cornflakes.
Well, it seems to me that what you're saying is that the impact of parapsychology and its related disciplines is more about understanding what it means to be human than a particular marketing strategy.
The whole process of education generally should be about encouraging us to completely rethink how we've lived our life up to that point, ideally, and to carry on for as long as we can possibly do it. And I think, the reading the stuff by Frederick Myers, William Barrett, Oliver Lodge, seeing these people with, high level scholastic skill, really high level and very firm beliefs in ways of looking at the world that you may or may not agree with. What I like about that material is that it challenges the frames that we just take for granted. So I'm reading, you read somebody like Oliver Lodge, who's wonderfully accessible. You may or may not believe in spiritualism, you may not believe in the survival of death, but you've got somebody that's lived a very interesting academic life and then was prominent at Liverpool University, and then had, really firmly believed that he was speaking to his son, and the evidence trail that he also marshals it's difficult not to finish some of his material and go, I don't know where I'm sitting with this, but it's making me think. And it's rare that, sometimes, it's sometimes very rare for me to pick up a book that's written recently that really does challenge the way I look at the world. And that's what I really liked about all of this material, because it made me read work by people that were incredibly impressive, incredibly knowledgeable, made me turn off the television and read another book because I was thinking, oh goodness, I'm wasting my life watching TV rather than reading something important. And then you see how they managed to turn these insights in Harlow Gale's work onto a discipline that then discounts these kinds of perspectives. So it alerts you to really rigorous scholarship, the highly political nature of knowledge production, and the fact that still continues today. In fact, if anything, whether you're in the US or the UK or anywhere else at the moment, if you're like somebody like Harlow Gale that's willing to challenge received wisdom, that's challenging institutional authorities, and is saying things that really go against the grain. It ruined his academic career. He had a very short academic career, And he was fairly significantly persecuted for it. And you think, okay, there are lessons to be taken from this, whether it's Gale or it's Teilhard de Chardin or somebody else. I like the fact that you've got the people with the tenacity to pursue a way of looking at the world, and they'll pursue it with a degree of integrity that I can't but applaud. And it makes you kind of go, well, I need to be a bit more like that at points when you think, well, should I say that or should I not? Well, that's what I should be saying. Should I avoid it? I'm going to say it. And I like that about people.
Well, Mark, this has been a fascinating conversation. You are clearly on the cutting edge of your discipline. I personally think you are riding a wave that is going to only grow in size. And I'd like to think I'm doing the same thing. So it's been a joy to be with you. I hope that we can have many more conversations.
I would really, really like that. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for writing the books. Thank you for. I'm looking forward to the film that's coming up, The PK Man. Again, thank you for everything, because again, this is university level instruction that I can get every morning when I turn my computer on. It's wonderful.
It's a great pleasure for me to be able to do it and to connect with somebody such as yourself. It's an honor.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 4 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.